Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. This is not just another story. It's a journey into truth, memory, and the quiet strength it takes to reclaim a life that was taken away. By the time Marilyn Hale turned 76, time no longer felt like a straight line. It had softened into something circular, repetitive, measured not in years or seasons, but in routines. Morning medications arrived on a small plastic cart. Meals appeared at fixed hours, regardless of hunger. Lights dimmed at night whether sleep came or not. In the private elder care facility where she lived, time was something managed for residents, not experienced by them. It was designed that way, Marilyn had learned early on. Structure reduced questions. Predictability discouraged resistance. The building itself was modern enough to avoid suspicion. Wide hallways, neutral decor, safety rails along the walls. Everything communicated care and professionalism. Families touring the place saw comfort, oversight, order. They did not see what happened after months turned into years, when a resident's sense of self slowly eroded under the weight of schedules that did not belong to them and decisions they were no longer allowed to make. Marilyn had arrived here nearly 2 decades earlier, in the aftermath of her husband's death. The move had been framed as temporary, a sensible arrangement until grief loosened its grip. She remembered signing papers at the kitchen table, hands still shaking from the funeral, trusting the children who sat across from her and told her it was only for her safety. She remembered believing them. At the time, belief felt easier than argument. The facility encouraged that mindset. Residents who accepted help without objection were labeled cooperative. Those who questioned paperwork or asked about finances were described as confused. Marilyn learned quickly where the invisible lines were drawn. She learned that asking for bank statements brought polite deflections, that requesting independent legal advice was noted in her file. That persistent curiosity resulted in medication adjustments that dulled the edges of thought. None of this was stated outright. It never needed to be. So Marilyn adapted. She stopped asking questions out loud and began storing them elsewhere. She watched. She listened. She paid attention to details others overlooked because they had given up the effort of noticing. Over time, invisibility became her shield. Not the kind that erased her completely, but the kind that allowed her to exist without attracting scrutiny. Staff came to see her as low maintenance, reliable, harmless. Days passed in small increments. She learned which caregivers hurried through their rounds and which lingered. She memorized the sounds of the building at night, the hum of the ventilation system, the distant rattle of a service elevator, the precise moment when the security desk changed shifts. None of this had purpose at first. It was simply a way to remain awake in a place that encouraged sleep. Her memories of life before the facility were sharper than the present. The house in the suburbs, modest but well kept. Her husband's habit of fixing things himself, even when hiring someone would have been easier. The garden he never quite finished. Those memories returned to her with a clarity that unsettled the doctors during periodic evaluations. They preferred vagueness. Nostalgia was acceptable. Precision was not. Marilyn learned to soften her recollections when asked, to blur edges that had never actually faded. The official narrative of her residency was simple. Widowed, no longer fully independent. Children acting in her best interest. It was a narrative that required little maintenance as long as no one challenged it. Her children visited in the early years, long enough to ensure compliance with the arrangement, then less frequently as time went on. Eventually, their presence became an annual occurrence, then a holiday card, then nothing at all. The facility did not question the absence. Bills were paid, that was enough. What Marilyn understood, slowly and without drama, was that she had been removed not because she was incapable, but because she was inconvenient. Her husband had handled finances meticulously. After his death, access to those finances became a matter of urgency for others. The solution had been efficient and legal on paper. A system built to protect could also contain. It only required consent at the right moment. Years passed like that, indistinguishable from one another. Residents came and went. Some died quietly. Others were transferred elsewhere when insurance changed, or families made new arrangements. Marilyn stayed. She was stable. That word followed her through every annual review. Stable meant predictable. Predictable meant ignorable. It was during one such ordinary afternoon that something shifted. She had been sitting near the common area, close enough to hear, but far enough to be overlooked. Two staff members spoke in low voices about an upcoming internal review. Audits were mentioned, paperwork, oversight. The tone was casual, but one detail caught Marilyn's attention and held it. There was mention of long-term residents whose legal statuses were unclear, of properties still registered under names that no longer appeared in active financial files, of houses that had never been sold, never transferred, simply left behind. One address was referenced vaguely, enough to trigger recognition rather than certainty. A house in the suburbs, abandoned. Still tied to a woman who had lived in the facility longer than anyone could remember. The staff moved on. The conversation ended. But Marilyn did not return to her crossword puzzle. The idea lodged itself in her mind and refused to be dismissed. The house. Her house. She had assumed it was gone. Sold off quietly. Dissolved into numbers she was no longer permitted to see. That assumption had kept her still. Now it wavered. That night, lying awake in the narrow bed that had replaced her own long ago, Marilyn let the thought unfold. If the house was still legally hers, then the story she had been told was incomplete. If it was incomplete, then other things might be as well. The system relied on her acceptance of a version of reality that discouraged verification. Verification required access, and access was precisely what had been taken from her. Hope was dangerous in a place like this. Hope led to questions, and questions led to consequences. Marilyn understood the risk instinctively. She had watched others make the mistake of pushing too hard, too fast. They were labeled difficult. Their privileges narrowed. Some were moved to more restrictive wings. Marilyn had no intention of joining them. Instead, she returned to observation with a new purpose. She paid closer attention to administrative routines. She noted which offices handled records and which staff members had access to them. She watched how mail was distributed, how documents were filed, how often external reviewers appeared, and what made them uncomfortable. None of this altered her outward behavior. She remained compliant, quiet, invisible. The facility continued its routines, unaware that something fundamental had changed. Marilyn no longer believed the story she had been given. She did not yet know the truth, but she understood that the truth existed independently of the version she had been allowed to see. That understanding settled into her with a calm that surprised her. It was not anger that sustained her, nor grief. It was clarity. The place where she lived had been designed to keep people safe by limiting them. Over time, those limits became indistinguishable from confinement. Marilyn had accepted that confinement because she believed it was justified. Now, for the first time in years, she considered the possibility that it had never been necessary at all. As the days resumed their predictable rhythm, Marilyn moved through them unchanged to any outside observer. But internally, she had crossed a line. She had begun to account for herself again. The thought of the house remained with her, persistent and unresolved, drawing her attention forward. Whatever had been taken from her had not vanished. It had merely been left unattended. And unattended things, she knew, had a way of resurfacing. The idea did not leave Marilyn after that afternoon. It settled into her thoughts with an unsettling persistence, resurfacing at odd moments, threading itself through the routines that had once dulled her awareness. The possibility that her house still existed, not as a memory, but as a legal reality, altered the texture of her days. Nothing outward changed. She still rose when the lights came on, swallowed the pills placed in her palm, ate meals she had not chosen. But inwardly, her attention sharpened. Hope, she understood, was not something to indulge openly. In a place like this, hope was treated as a symptom. She tested the edges of what she could safely learn. Small questions, framed innocently, asked at the right moments. Casual remarks about paperwork, taxes, old addresses. She paid attention to reactions rather than answers. Evasions were as informative as confirmations. Over time, a picture began to form, incomplete but troubling. Her financial affairs were managed through an external trustee appointed years earlier, at the request of her children. The facility deferred to that authority. No one here felt responsible for explaining the arrangement to her. It had been settled long ago, and settled matters were not revisited. What unsettled Marilyn most was not the control itself, but the carelessness with which it was exercised. Files were misfiled. Notes contradicted one another. No one seemed entirely sure which documents governed her situation, only that it was not her place to ask. This looseness suggested neglect rather than oversight. It suggested that the system assumed compliance indefinitely. She became acutely aware of the consequences of missteps. One resident, newly admitted, questioned a charge on his account and demanded to speak with an attorney. Within weeks, his medication was adjusted, his access to communal areas restricted. The explanation offered was concern for his agitation. Marilyn observed the progression without comment. It reinforced what she already knew. Resistance would not be met with argument, but with sedation and isolation. The institution had learned to neutralize disruption quietly. That knowledge guided her restraint. She did not confront anyone. She did not express outrage. She stored information and waited. The waiting was not passive. It was deliberate, disciplined. She began to think in terms of timing, of opportunity. If there were audits coming, as the staff conversation suggested, then records would be examined by people not accustomed to unquestioned authority. External eyes changed dynamics. External eyes noticed inconsistencies, but external eyes also triggered defensive behavior. Administrators grew cautious. Files were reorganized. Staff were reminded of protocols. Marilyn sensed the shift and adjusted accordingly. She withdrew further, allowing attention to flow elsewhere. Invisibility had kept her safe for years. It would serve her again. Privately, she weighed the risks of action against the certainty of remaining. If she did nothing, the rest of her life would pass within these walls, regulated and diminished, until she became one of the many residents who died quietly and were spoken of briefly in administrative meetings. If she acted prematurely, she risked losing even the fragile clarity she still possessed. The margin for error was narrow. The house became her anchor. She reconstructed it in her mind, room by room, grounding herself in something tangible. She recalled the weight of the front door, the sound it made when closed, the way afternoon light fell across the living room floor. These memories were not sentimental indulgences. They were proof that her life had existed outside the institution, that it had texture and continuity. Proof that she had not always been an object of care. Slowly, a decision formed. not as a moment of resolve, but as an accumulation. She would not wait for the system to correct itself. Systems rarely did. She would not announce her intentions. She would prepare quietly, as she had learned to do everything here. Preparation was an extension of observation. She began to note practical details with a new focus. She learned the rhythms of staffing more precisely, which shifts were overworked and which were understaffed, which supervisors trusted their subordinates enough to leave gaps unmonitored. She noticed that weekends brought fewer administrators and more temporary staff unfamiliar with residents' histories. She learned when maintenance carts were left unattended, when doors were propped open for convenience rather than security. She took stock of what she possessed. Over the years, she had accumulated small amounts of cash, change overlooked by staff, gift cards forgotten in drawers. Nothing substantial, but enough to imagine movement. She evaluated her physical limits honestly. Her body was no longer resilient, but it was not as fragile as the facility assumed. Years of careful self-preservation had left her weak but functional. Fear accompanied these calculations, but it did not dominate them. Fear had long since been integrated into her thinking, a constant rather than an obstacle. What concerned her more was the possibility of discovery before readiness. A single misinterpreted action could unravel everything. She became more careful, not less, concealing intention beneath routine. As days passed, the audit drew closer. Marilyn sensed unease among staff, a subtle tightening of procedure. Files were locked more frequently, offices were closed. The window she had anticipated might be narrowing rather than opening. That realization forced a reconsideration. Waiting carried its own risks. The longer she remained, the greater the chance that any unresolved irregularities would be quietly corrected without her involvement. One evening, as she lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of the building settling, Marilyn accepted what she had been resisting. If she wanted answers, she would have to leave. Not permanently, perhaps, but long enough to see for herself. The thought was both terrifying and clarifying. Escape was not a dramatic gesture in her mind. It was a practical step toward information. She imagined the act itself not as flight, but as movement. Movement had been denied to her in ways so subtle they had seemed benign. Restoring it felt like reclaiming something essential. She did not romanticize the risk. She understood the consequences if she failed. But she also understood that compliance guaranteed a different kind of failure, quieter and irreversible. The plan began to take shape, slow and methodical. She selected a time when scrutiny would be minimal, when staff fatigue created blind spots. She memorized routes, distances, sequences. She rehearsed mentally, refining each step until it felt inevitable rather than reckless. The more she planned, the calmer she became. Anxiety gave way to focus. On the surface, Marilyn remained exactly what the institution expected her to be: cooperative, unremarkable, forgettable. Inside, she was assembling the means to disrupt the story that had been written for her. Hope, she understood now, was dangerous only when it was visible. Kept hidden, it became something else entirely. It became strategy. As the chosen day approached, Marilyn did not allow herself to dwell on outcomes. She thought only of the next action, the next moment. The house waited, whether it stood or not. The truth waited, whether it was kind or cruel. What mattered was that she would no longer wait passively for permission to exist. The facility slept each night believing it contained her. In reality, containment required belief, and Marilyn's belief had quietly, irrevocably shifted. Marilyn did not think of the night she left the facility as an escape. That word carried unnecessary drama, an implication of panic or desperation. What she felt instead was a quiet inevitability, the sense that she was simply stepping into a moment that had been approaching for years. When the time came, it arrived without ceremony, folded into the ordinary end of an ordinary day. The weather worked in her favor. A steady rain had settled over the area since late afternoon, the kind that discouraged unnecessary movement and made staff eager to finish their rounds quickly. Rain softened sound. It blurred edges. Marilyn had learned long ago that discomfort created inattention. She ate her dinner without remark, accepted her medications, and returned to her room as she always did. Nothing in her behavior invited a second glance. When the hallway lights dimmed and the facility settled into its nighttime hush, Marilyn waited. She counted the sounds as she always had. Distant doors closing, a cart rolling, the faint murmur of a television somewhere down the corridor. At the moment she had calculated and recalculated for weeks, she rose from her bed and dressed in layers she had quietly assembled over time. Clothing meant for comfort rather than appearance, chosen for warmth and mobility. She moved slowly, conserving energy, listening for changes in rhythm. The route she followed was not the most direct, but the least observed. She walked with purpose, not haste, understanding that confidence often passed unnoticed. Doors she had seen propped open countless times were open now, just as she expected. The building, accustomed to her compliance, offered no resistance. It had never been designed to stop someone who did not announce themselves as a problem. When she stepped outside, the rain met her fully, cold and real against her skin. The sensation was startling after years of filtered air and regulated temperatures. She paused only long enough to orient herself, then moved forward, guided by memory and careful planning. Each step carried effort. Her body protested in familiar ways, joints stiff and lungs unaccustomed to exertion. She acknowledged the pain and continued. Pain was information, not instruction. Reaching the road felt less like triumph than transition. The facility receded behind her, its lights softened by rain, its presence diminished. She did not look back. Looking back implied doubt, and doubt was a luxury she could not afford. Instead, she focused on the next stage, the part of the plan that depended least on memory and most on endurance. Public transportation was both familiar and foreign. Marilyn had ridden buses for most of her adult life, but decades had altered routes, schedules, and systems. When the bus finally arrived, its headlights cutting through the rain, she climbed aboard without hesitation. The driver glanced at her briefly, registered her presence as unremarkable, and continued. That small act of indifference felt like freedom. As the bus carried her away from the facility, Marilyn allowed herself a moment to absorb the significance of what she had done. She was among people who did not know her history, did not monitor her compliance, did not hold her past against her. She was simply another passenger, damp and tired, moving through the world on her own terms. The anonymity steadied her. The journey took longer than she expected. Towns had expanded, roads rerouted. Places that had once been fields were now clusters of stores and housing developments. Marilyn watched through the rain-streaked window, recognizing landmarks that no longer existed and missing ones that should have been there. Time had not paused for her absence. It had advanced without regard. When she finally disembarked, the town felt both familiar and alien. The scale was the same, but details had shifted. Buildings had been replaced, businesses renamed. She navigated by instinct more than certainty, following routes that had once been second nature. Each step toward the house carried a mixture of anticipation and dread. She had prepared herself for deterioration, but preparation did not lessen the impact. The house stood at the end of the street, unmistakable despite its condition. Neglect had transformed it. Paint peeled. The yard had surrendered to weeds and overgrowth. Windows were dark, some broken, others boarded. It looked abandoned, a structure the town had learned to ignore. Marilyn stopped at the edge of the property and took it in, the physical manifestation of years she had not been allowed to live. Crossing the threshold of the yard felt heavier than leaving the facility. This was where her life had been interrupted, where decisions had been made without her consent. The house bore those decisions silently. She moved toward the entrance, her steps cautious but determined. The door resisted at first, then yielded with a sound that echoed too loudly in the quiet street. Inside, the air was stale, layered with dust and the slow decay of disuse. Marilyn stood still, letting her eyes adjust, letting memory overlay reality. The interior was stripped of most furnishings, the absence more striking than any damage. What remained were the bones of the place, walls and fixtures that had outlasted attention. She moved through the rooms deliberately, orienting herself. The kitchen, once the center of daily life, was gutted and cold. The living room showed signs of water damage, a ceiling sagging where time had asserted itself. Yet beneath the decay, the structure endured. Built-in elements crafted by her husband remained, warped but intact. They were anchors, proof of intention and care. Marilyn knelt near one such fixture, her movements slow and careful. She had not thought of this as hope, but it was. The knowledge her husband had shared with her years earlier, almost casually, about the small precautions he had taken. A hidden space, a contingency. At the time, it had seemed unnecessary. Now, it felt prescient. When the mechanism yielded and the concealed compartment opened, Marilyn felt a release she had not anticipated. Inside lay objects untouched by the years. Documents sealed against moisture, a metal box, papers arranged with deliberate order. She did not open them immediately. The act of finding them was enough for the moment. It confirmed that she had not been wrong to leave, that her intuition had been grounded in reality. Exhaustion caught up with her then, heavy and unavoidable. She lowered herself to the floor, the lockbox close at hand, and allowed herself to breathe. The world outside the facility had not waited for her, but it had not erased her either. The house stood. The evidence existed. What came next would require strength she did not yet have. As dawn approached, light filtering through broken windows, Marilyn understood that returning was only the beginning. She had stepped out of containment and into uncertainty. The answers she sought lay ahead, not behind, and she would have to face them awake in a world that no longer made allowances for her absence. Marilyn waited until the light was strong enough to see clearly before opening the lockbox. The house around her creaked softly as it adjusted to the morning air, a sound she remembered well, though it had been years since she had heard it. Dawn filtered through the damaged windows in uneven bands, illuminating dust and debris, revealing both the neglect and the stubborn endurance of the place. She sat on the living room floor, her back against the wall, the metal box resting in her lap like something fragile despite its weight. She did not rush. Years of institutional life had taught her patience of a particular kind, the patience that comes from knowing that haste is often punished and deliberation overlooked. She took a moment to steady her hands, to acknowledge the exhaustion that still clung to her body, and then she opened the box. Inside were documents arranged with the same careful order her husband had applied to everything he touched. Deeds, bank records, insurance papers, tax filings, all preserved in protective sleeves. The first thing Marilyn noticed was the date range. The records did not stop with his death. They extended beyond it, tracing the months leading up to it with a precision that felt deliberate. Her husband had not merely prepared for contingencies, he had anticipated them. The deed to the house lay near the top, original and unaltered, bearing both their names. Marilyn's breath caught as she read it, not because she had forgotten what it said, but because she had been led to believe it no longer mattered. According to this document, it mattered very much. The house had never changed hands. Whatever her children had told her, whatever assumptions she had made, the legal reality was starkly different. Beneath the deed were financial records that told a story she had only partially understood before. Withdrawals timed to coincide with her husband's declining health. Requests for access framed as temporary assistance. Signatures that were not hers, authorizing changes she had never discussed. The pattern was unmistakable. This was not the confusion of grief or the chaos of medical expense. It was a methodical repositioning of control. Marilyn set those papers aside and reached for a thicker envelope tucked beneath them. Inside were printed emails and handwritten notes, preserved with equal care. As she read, the narrative sharpened further. Discussions between her children about the necessity of formal oversight. Concerns about her ability to manage assets. References to professional advice that framed removal from her home as both protective and practical. Nowhere did the documents express uncertainty. The decision had been made before she was ever consulted. The most unsettling discovery came last. A series of letters from legal and financial professionals, written in language that balanced caution with compliance. They did not question the arrangement. They facilitated it. Marilyn understood then that what had happened to her had not been an aberration. It had been enabled at every step by people who accepted the version of events presented to them because it was convenient to do so. She closed the lockbox and sat in silence, the weight of comprehension settling slowly. The betrayal was not new, but the clarity was. For years, doubt had hovered at the edges of her understanding, blunted by medication and routine. Now, doubt dissolved into certainty. She had not misremembered. She had not misunderstood. The life she had lost had been taken deliberately. The realization did not break her. It steadied her. Anger might come later, but for now, there was only focus. She cataloged what she had found, mentally noting what could be used and what merely contextualized the larger picture. Evidence required corroboration. Proof required process. None of this could be accomplished alone. Marilyn knew she could not remain in the house indefinitely. Its condition made that impossible, and its visibility made it dangerous. She was not naive about the likelihood that someone would notice her absence from the facility. The system she had left behind would not simply absorb that disruption without response. She needed concealment, at least temporarily, and she needed allies. She chose the basement for shelter. It was the most intact part of the house, shielded from the street and less affected by weather. There, she found old blankets, canned goods long past usefulness but stored with intention, and candles sealed against moisture. Her husband's careful nature had extended even here. She rested when she could, tending to her body as best she knew how, aware that injury or illness now carried greater risk. At night, she ventured out briefly, purchasing basic supplies from places where she would not be remembered. During the day, she remained still, reading and rereading the documents, committing their contents to memory. She understood that possession was temporary. Knowledge was not. If the evidence were taken from her, she would still have its shape, its sequence. The question of what to do next pressed insistently. Returning to the facility was unthinkable. Approaching authorities directly felt equally risky. Marilyn was keenly aware of how easily her credibility could be undermined. 30 years of institutionalization had left a paper trail that could be used against her. She needed intermediaries, people whose authority did not depend on dismissing her experience. On the third day, driven by necessity rather than confidence, she made her way to the public library. The building stood as a familiar constant amid the changes in the town, its purpose unchanged, even as its tools had evolved. Inside, she found access to information that had been denied to her for decades. Computers intimidated her at first, but persistence bridged the gap. She learned slowly, methodically, navigating public records and legal resources. What she found confirmed her fears and sharpened her resolve. The house was still registered in her name, flagged only by unresolved liens and unpaid taxes. No transfer had ever been completed. The legal oversight she had been told was absolute had been, in reality, partial and negligent. This discovery transformed her situation. She was not trespassing. She was returning. Marilyn printed what she could, conserving money, selecting only what strengthened her position: property records, trustee information, facility affiliations. The pieces aligned with the evidence from the lockbox, creating a coherent narrative that extended beyond personal grievance. This was not simply a family dispute. It was a systemic failure that had allowed convenience to override accountability. Armed with copies and a growing understanding of her options, Marilyn sought legal assistance. She chose a small nonprofit office not because she expected miracles, but because its mandate aligned with her circumstances. There, she presented her story without embellishment, without apology. She laid out the documents and allowed them to speak. For the first time in years, she was listened to without preconception. The attorney who reviewed her case did not dismiss her history. Instead, she contextualized it, recognizing the ways in which institutional records could obscure truth rather than reveal it. Marilyn felt something loosen within her, a tension she had carried so long it had become invisible. As the meeting concluded, Marilyn understood that her journey had entered a new phase. She was no longer acting solely in secrecy, relying on caution and invisibility. She had stepped into a process that would demand exposure and endurance. The evidence she carried was powerful, but it also made her vulnerable. The system she was challenging would not relinquish control quietly. Leaving the office, Marilyn felt the weight of what lay ahead. The house had given her proof. The truth had given her direction. What remained was the hardest part: transforming private certainty into public reckoning. She walked back into the daylight with measured steps, aware that every choice now carried consequence. Behind her, the silence of the house lingered, no longer empty but charged with meaning. Beneath years of neglect and enforced quiet, it had held what she needed. Now, it was up to her to decide how that silence would finally be broken. The days that followed no longer belonged solely to Marilyn. Once she had crossed the threshold from private knowledge to shared evidence, time accelerated in a way she had almost forgotten was possible. What had once taken years of waiting now unfolded in weeks, sometimes days, propelled by the momentum of institutions forced to respond rather than ignore. The small legal office where she had first laid out her documents became the center of her new existence, not as a place of confinement, but as a place of coordination. Her legal status was the first obstacle to address. On paper, she remained under an active guardianship agreement, her absence from the care facility framed as unauthorized departure. That designation carried consequences. It meant that at any moment, someone could attempt to return her to the very environment she had fled. The attorney understood this risk immediately and moved with urgency, filing motions to challenge the validity of the guardianship itself. The argument was not emotional, but procedural. Consent obtained under distress. Oversight applied without periodic review. Financial interests intertwined with care decisions. Each point weakened the foundation of the arrangement that had held Marilyn in place for so long. During this period, Marilyn lived quietly, deliberately out of sight. She stayed in a small room above the legal office, a temporary arrangement offered without ceremony. It was not comfortable, but it was hers in a way nothing had been for decades. No one monitored her sleep, no one rationed her movement. The simplicity of that autonomy was almost overwhelming. She learned to pace herself, to rest when needed, to accept help without surrendering control. The journalist entered her life as a natural extension of the case rather than a dramatic turning point. Introduced by the attorney as someone experienced in institutional accountability, the reporter approached Marilyn not as a spectacle, but as a source. Their conversations were methodical, grounded in verification rather than reaction. Names were checked, records requested, patterns traced. What began as one woman's story expanded into something larger, more troubling. Through careful investigation, it became clear that Marilyn's experience was not isolated. Other residents from the same care facility had been placed under similar arrangements, their finances managed externally, their voices minimized. Some families had acted out of convenience rather than malice. Others had been more deliberate. The facility itself had benefited from the lack of scrutiny, collecting fees while deferring responsibility. Oversight agencies had conducted surface-level reviews that failed to interrogate the underlying structures. As these findings accumulated, the narrative shifted. Marilyn was no longer positioned as an individual exception, but as a representative case. That distinction mattered. It transformed her situation from a private dispute into a public concern. When the first article was published, it did not focus on her escape or her age. It focused on the system that had allowed a person to be removed from her life so completely without meaningful challenge. The response was immediate and uneven. Advocacy groups reached out. Regulatory bodies issued statements promising review. The care facility released carefully worded assurances of compliance and concern. Marilyn read these developments with measured attention. She did not mistake language for action. Years of institutional living had taught her how easily words could substitute for change. Her children responded differently. One attempted to disappear from the process entirely, retreating behind legal representation and silence. The other sought to reframe the past, offering explanations that positioned events as misunderstandings rather than decisions. Depositions followed, documents were introduced. The careful construction of their narrative began to unravel under scrutiny. Marilyn attended these proceedings not as an accuser, but as a witness. She did not raise her voice. She did not dramatize. The truth, presented plainly, was sufficient. The settlement that followed was comprehensive rather than punitive. The house was returned to her without encumbrance. Financial compensation was established to ensure her care on her own terms. More importantly, provisions were made to prevent similar arrangements from proceeding without independent review. These outcomes did not erase what had been taken from her, but they acknowledged it in a way she had long been denied. Throughout the process, Marilyn remained acutely aware of her own limits. Advocacy exhausted her. Public attention unsettled her. She learned to step back when necessary, trusting the professionals she had chosen to continue the work. Trust, once broken so thoroughly, did not return easily, but she cultivated it deliberately, understanding that isolation was no longer a viable strategy. When she finally returned to the house, it was not as an act of triumph, but of reclamation. Restoration took time. Walls were repaired, systems replaced. The work was careful, respectful of what had been while making space for what could still be. Marilyn supervised without micromanaging, guided by an intuitive understanding of what mattered. Some imperfections were left untouched. They bore witness. Living there again required adjustment. Freedom carried responsibilities she had not exercised in years. She relearned the rhythms of independent life slowly, forgiving herself for moments of uncertainty. The house did not judge her. It accepted her presence as it always had. The most unexpected development came later, quietly, without the force of legal process or public attention. A younger woman arrived one afternoon, uncertain, holding a photograph she had found among her family's belongings. The connection unfolded gradually, cautiously. Marilyn recognized in her the possibility of continuity, not as obligation, but as choice. Their relationship formed without demands, grounded in honesty rather than repair. As months passed, the broader impact of the case became visible. Regulatory reforms were proposed. Training standards revised, oversight mechanisms strengthened. Marilyn followed these changes with interest, but not ownership. She had not set out to reform a system. She had set out to understand what had been done to her. The fact that understanding led to change was something she accepted with quiet satisfaction. In the evenings, she sat in the restored living room, the light falling across familiar surfaces now renewed. The silence was different here. It was chosen rather than imposed. She reflected on the years that had been taken and the years that remained. Loss did not vanish, but it no longer defined her entirely. Marilyn understood that justice, as she experienced it, was not a single moment or verdict. It was the accumulation of small recognitions, the steady reassertion of presence in spaces that had excluded her. It was the ability to wake each morning and decide, for herself, what the day would hold. The reckoning she had brought about was not loud. It did not rely on spectacle. It unfolded through documents, through persistence, through the refusal to accept erasure. In that refusal, Marilyn found not only resolution, but continuity. Her life, interrupted but not ended, resumed its course, altered but intact. The world had not waited for her, but it had not closed entirely either. She had returned not to reclaim the past, but to inhabit the present fully. And in doing so, she ensured that what had been buried beneath silence would not be forgotten again. If this story stayed with you, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel to follow the next chapters and discover more stories about truth, resilience, and the people who refused to be erased. New videos are coming, and you won't want to miss what's next. If this video moved you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Stories like this matter more when they're passed on. Your support helps these voices reach further. Thank you for watching. Stay curious, stay aware, and take care of each other.